The Plain Folk and Their Role in Southern History by Frank Lawrence Owsley. Most travelers and critics who wrote about the South during the late antebellum period were of the opinion that the white inhabitants of the South generally fell into two categories, namely, the slaveholders and the poor whites. Moreover, whether or not they intended to do so, they created the impression in the popular mind that the slaveholder was a great planter living in a white columned mansion served by a squad of Negro slaves who obsequiously attended to his every want and whim. According to the opinion of such writers, these cavaliers were the great monopolists of their day. They crowded everyone not possessed of considerable wealth off the good lands, and even the lands from which modest profits might be realized. They dominated politics, religion, and all phases of public life. The 6 or 7 million non slaveholders, who comprised the remainder of the white population, and were, with minor exceptions, considered poor whites or poor white trash, were visualized as a sorry lot indeed. They had been pushed off by the planters into the pine barrens and sterile sand hills and mountains. Here, as squatters upon abandoned lands and government tracts, they dwelt in squalid log huts and kept alive by hunting and fishing, and by growing patches of corn, sweet potatoes, collards, and pumpkins in the small deadenings or clearings they had made in the all engulfing wilderness. They were illiterate, shiftless, irresponsible, frequently vicious, and nearly always addicted to the use of rot gut whiskey and to dirt eating. Many, perhaps nearly all, according to later writers, had malaria, hookworm, and pellagra. Between the great unwashed and the slaveholders, there was a chasm that could not be bridged. The non slaveholders were 6 or 7 million supernumeraries in a slaveholding society. Frederick Law Olmsted, perhaps, contributed more than any other writer to the version of Southern society sketched above, for he was possessed of unusual skill in the art of reporting detail and of completely wiping out the validity of such detail by subjective comments and generalizations. For example, despite the fact that he saw little destitution and almost constant evidence of well being among the poorer folk, he was still able to conclude that the majority of the Negroes at the North live more comfortably than the majority of whites at the South. That, indeed, the majority of the people of the South were poor whites. It was not, in his opinion, sterile soil and unhealthful climate that created the great mass of poor whites, but slavery. For manual agricultural labor, Olmsted wrote, the free man looking on has a contempt, and for its necessity in himself, if such necessity exists, a pity quite beyond that of the man under whose observation it has been free from such an association of ideas. Olmsted could make this generalization, despite the fact that throughout his extensive travels in the South, he had constantly observed Negro slaves and whites working in the fields together. Indeed, the degradation of free labor by slavery was Olmsted's major premise, from which all conclusions flowed, regardless of the factual observations that he conscientiously incorporated in his books. Other writers who had little or no first hand knowledge of the South quite naturally relied on the writings of travelers, and particularly Olmsted, who was regarded as dispassionate and authoritative. Their tendency was to seize upon the generalizations rather than the detailed reporting of the travel literature, with the result that they further simplified the picture of Southern society. George M. Weston's Poor Whites of the South and his Progress of Slavery in the United States are excellent examples of this process of simplification. The whites of the South, not connected with the ownership or management of slaves, he wrote, constituting not far from 3/4 of the whole number of whites, confined at least to the low wages of agricultural labor, and partly cut off even from this by the degradation of a companionship with black slaves, retire to the outskirts of civilization, where they lead a semi savage life, sinking deeper and more hopelessly into barbarism with each succeeding generation. The slave owner takes at first all the best lands, and finally all the lands susceptible of regular cultivation, and the poor whites, thrown back upon the hills and upon the sterile soils, are mere squatters without energy enough to acquire the title even to the cheap lands they occupy, without roads, and at length without even a desire for education. J. E. Carnes, the British economist, presented the final stereotype of Southern society in his book, The Slave Power. Carnes appears to have rested his generalizations about the social structure of the South largely upon those of Olmsted, Weston, and Hinton R. Helper. It was a pyramid upon a pyramid. But it was a picture of Southern society that made a deep and lasting impression. The constitution of a slave society resolves itself into three classes, writes Carnes, broadly distinguished from each other and connected by no common interest: the slaves on whom devolves all the regular industry, the slaveholders who reap all its fruits, and an idle and lawless rabble who live dispersed over vast plains in a condition little removed from absolute barbarism. These mean whites are the natural growth of the slave system. Regular industry is only known to them as the vocation of slaves, and it is the one fate which, above all others, they desire to avoid. In the southern states, no less than 5 million human beings, who have been expelled from the good lands by the slaveholders, are now said to exist in a condition little removed from savage life, eking out a wretched subsistence by hunting, fishing, by hiring themselves out for occasional jobs, and by plunder. The generalization that these writers made about the Old South, which may well be considered the first version of Tobacco Road, should be kept in mind, for they have been subjected to frequent examination in preparing this study and will be points of reference in it. A few Southern historians have accepted in whole or in part the picture of the society of the Old South as portrayed by such writers as those quoted previously, but most of them, without doubt, have regarded it as fantastic. Sometimes, with an expression of indignation on their faces, they will say, "Folks are just not like that in the South. Society is not and never has been divided into rich and poor." Those who were born before 1890 had a first hand acquaintance with one or often two generations who had lived before 1860 and who were not, nor had they ever been, either poor whites or planters. For example, outstanding Southern historians such as J. G. D. Rulehack Hamilton, Charles W. Ramsdell, George Petrie, and Walter Linwood Fleming grew up in communities where heads of many families, including their own, had been reared before 1860. It will, perhaps, drive home the idea as to how well antebellum Southern society was known by those born prior to the close of the last century if it is remarked that Confederate soldiers in 1900 were about the average age of veterans of World War I in 1949. Possessed of this first hand acquaintance with numerous representatives of the Old South, Southern historians have, with few exceptions up until this time, strongly maintained that the white people of the antebellum rural South were not divided into the simple categories of rich planter and poor white. As time has passed, and with it the older generations, even stronger assertions are being made concerning the plain folk of the Old South, and indeed concerning the whole society in that region. The tone of some of these claims is somewhat indignant, just as the tone of anyone tends to grow indignant when he knows from his own observations and experiences whereof he speaks, but discovers that his star witnesses have disappeared from the court. The truth of the matter is that for good reasons, such as a lack of trained historians in the South until well after the opening of the present century, the testimony of these star witnesses, the survivors of the old regime, was not taken while they were numerous enough and young enough for their evidence to be both full and valid. It has been assumed, too, quite naturally, that since the farmers and small planters, unlike the large planters and businessmen, seldom preserved their private papers and business accounts, no record of their manner of life and their place in the Southern society remained after they passed on. But these millions of people did leave records of their lives: the church records, wills, administration of estates, county court minutes, marriage licenses, inventory of estates, trial records, mortgage books, deed books, county tax books, and the manuscript returns of the federal censuses. Other important sources from which much can be learned, not only about the plain folk, but about society as a whole in the South, are the older county and town histories, biographies, autobiographies, and recollections of men and women of only local importance: preachers, lawyers, doctors, county newspaper editors, and the like, who knew every family in the county and frequently in a much wider area. Last but not least must be mentioned the writings of those sojourners in the South who remained in one place long enough to become acquainted with the country and the people. Out of such documents, a picture of the whole people can be constructed, not just that of the great planter and merchant, but, in the words of an old jingle, rich man, poor man, beggar man, thief, doctor, lawyer, merchant, chief. Of all these sources, the county records and the unpublished census reports, which are made by the county for each individual, are the most valuable documents from which to study the life of the people as a whole. It is only by employing them in great volume, however, and receiving a cumulative effect, that they can at all be usefully employed. Upon reading page after page of tax lists and census returns, both of which give the land holdings and much of the personal property of all individuals, the picture of the economic structure of the Old South gradually takes form. These sources reveal the existence of a society of great complexity. Instead of the simple twofold division of the agricultural population into slaveholders and non slaveholding poor whites, many economic groups appear. Among the slaveholders, there were great planters possessed of thousands of acres of land and hundreds of slaves, planters owning 1,000 or fewer acres and 2 score slaves, small planters with 500 acres and 10 or 15 slaves, large farmers with 300 or 400 acres and 5 to 10 slaves, small farmers with 200 or fewer acres and 1 or 2 slaves. Among the non slaveholders were large farmers employing hired labor who owned from 200 to 1,000 acres, a middle group which owned from 100 to 200 acres, one horse farmers with less than 100 acres, and landless renters, squatters, farm laborers, and a leisure class whose means of support does not appear on the record. But the core of the social structure was a massive body of plain folk who were neither rich nor very poor. These were employed in numerous occupations, but the great majority secured their food, clothing, and shelter from some rural pursuit, chiefly farming and livestock grazing. It is the plain country folk with whom this study is most concerned, that great mass of several millions who were not part of the plantation economy. The group included the small slaveholding farmers, the non slaveholders who owned the land which they cultivated, the numerous herdsmen on the frontier, pine barrens, and mountains, and those tenant farmers whose agricultural production, as recorded in the census, indicated thrift, energy, and self respect. It is impossible to convey the picture thus formed by comprehensive examination of tax lists and census reports to those who have not scrutinized these documents to some extent. But, as is so often true under such circumstances, it becomes necessary to resort to abstractions. In this case, that means, of course, a statistical analysis, which is the basis for this study. Only general conclusions will be presented here. The slaveholding families composed nearly one-third of the white population of the South, and most of them were small slave owners and small landowners. As estimated, 60% owned from 1 to 5 slaves, and another large group held from 5 to 10. Most slaveholders, whose chief occupation was agriculture, owned their farms, and the small slaveholders, as would be expected, were small landowners. At least 60% of the small slaveholders had farms ranging in size from 50 to 300 acres. Over 60% of the non slaveholders outside the upper seaboard states, who, it will be recalled, were classified as poor white trash, were also landowners. In the lower South and in portions of the upper South central states, an estimated 70% owned farms. The sizes of their holdings differed very little from those of the small slaveholders. About 75% ranged from a few to 200 acres, and the other 25% were above 200 acres in size. If one considers the landed resources that were available to the Southern people between the Revolution and the Civil War, it will become apparent why the bulk of the Southern rural population, non slaveholder and slaveholder alike, acquired the ownership of farmsteads and plantations, and how it was that the herdsmen had such ample pasturage for their livestock. A goodly portion of the federal public domain, which totaled 1,309,591,680 acres, and over 200 million acres of state lands in Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, and Texas, had been open to Southerners during this period. The opportunity for acquiring land was greater in the South than in the North. For example, in 1848, before the creation of Oregon Territory, the area of the states and organized territories of the South was more than twice as great as that of the North, whereas the population of the South was scarcely half that of the North. At all times during the interval between the Revolution and the Civil War, the combined federal and state public domains in the South were greater than those open to settlement in the North, and the population was increasingly less. But the Southern farmers had another great advantage over the Northerners in that the grain, livestock, and tobacco farmers of the Upper South and the Southern Highlands could and did move into the lower parts of the Northwest, whereas the Northern farmers could not profitably move south. The tax lists and census reports enable us to determine with reasonable accuracy the social structure of the rural South, and they are in some degree a measure of the economic struggle of the people. They give us, however, only an impersonal, external view. They furnish, let us say, a picture of the economic man, not the social, gregarious human. It is such documents as grand jury reports, trial records, court minutes, and wills that furnish the vital spark and recreate the individual, the family, and the community. The wills, especially, often so personal and intimate, go far towards supplying a substitute for the private letters and diaries which the common folk, unlike the planters, failed to preserve. The wills also reveal many family customs. The role of the Southern folk was scarcely that of a supernumerary in any phase of Southern life. To deal with them, as has been the tendency in studying the plantation economy, either as a formless mass or filler that settles into the cracks and crevices left by the planters, is to take a narrow and incomplete view of Southern society. On the other hand, to deal with the plain folk as a class conscious group, bitter and resentful toward the aristocracy because of exploitation and neglect of the latter, is even farther from reality. The Southern folk were, as has been repeatedly said, a close knit people, but they were not class conscious in the Marxian sense, for with rare exceptions, they did not regard the planters and men of wealth as their oppressors. On the contrary, they admired them as a rule and looked with approval on their success, and they assumed, on the basis of much tangible evidence, that the door of economic opportunity swung open easily to the thrust of their own ambitious and energetic sons and daughters. Indeed, it was considered a common occurrence outside the older states of Virginia and the Carolinas for the rank and file to move upward in the economic scale, and for individuals in every community to become well to do planters, political leaders, and members of a learned profession. Relatively few of the plain folk, however, seem to have had a desire to become wealthy. Their ambition was to acquire land and other property sufficient to give them and their children a sense of security and well being, to be good livers, and have something saved for a rainy day, as they would have put it. Nevertheless, the knowledge that the economic door was not bolted against themselves and their children tended to stifle the development of a jealous and bitter class consciousness. The abundance of cheap land, the generally high prices received for farm products and livestock, and the rapidly developing political democracy were the principal means of keeping the economic door unlocked and preventing the development of a sense of frustration and resentment against the more wealthy. There were also other important forces that diminished the feeling of class stratification and helped in the creation of a sense of unity between the plain folk and the aristocracy. Such were the association of rich and poor in all religious activities and in the schools, the frequent ties of blood kinship between them, and the generally folkish and democratic bearing of the aristocracy. This sense of unity between all social and economic groups cannot be stressed too much in view of the strongly and widely held opinion to the contrary. Indeed, when the entire social and economic structure of the Old South is placed in perspective, rather than viewing each segment as a separate thing, all parts will be seen as bearing a relation to the whole. It is then that the plain folk appear not as supernumeraries, but as a vital element of the social and economic structure of the Old South. A grazing and farm economy, rather than a plantation economy, was practiced by nearly all of the non slaveholders, and by 60 to 80% of the slaveholders. Farm economy meant a diversified, self sufficient type of agriculture where the money crops were subordinated to food crops, and where the labor was performed by the family, aided by a few slaves. Plantation economy depended upon slave labor and usually specialized in the production of one or more of the staple crops, such as cotton, sugarcane, rice, and tobacco. Food crops and livestock were not neglected, as a rule, by the planters. In fact, they frequently produced enough corn for their own use, but such crops were generally subordinated to the money crops. As a result of the self sufficiency of farm economy, the farmers were seldom involved in indebtedness once they had paid for their lands. Farm economy, together with livestock grazing, not only furnished support for the farmers and herdsmen who composed the bulk of the southern population, but supplied a large portion of the hogs, cattle, breadstuffs purchased for the plantations. Indeed, the farmers and grazers would have easily supplied the entire needs of the South for beef and pork had not the greater portion of the cattle and hogs been driven to the seaports such as Philadelphia, Baltimore, Charleston, Savannah, Mobile, and New Orleans, where they were usually slaughtered and shipped to the eastern markets or to the West Indies. Why these cattle and hogs were thus disposed of instead of being sold directly to the planters is a question that can be answered perhaps by a careful study of the weather map. The warm and damp winters of the lower South caused meat to spoil quickly and rendered large scale slaughter and preservation of meat on the plantations a hazardous business, with the result that the larger drovers could not depend on the plantation markets. The planters often complained in their diaries and letters of their meat supply being spoiled by warm weather. For example, Mrs. C. C. Clay of Huntsville, Alabama, wrote her husband on December 5, 1828, that Augustine has gone to Tennessee in quest of pork. The weather bids fair for the same difficulty to exist in keeping pork that there was last year. On January 7, 1845, over 16 years later, Mrs. Clay's son, Hugh Lawson Clay, writes his mother that the weather is bad, very bad, warm and rainy, fair for spoiling pork, and for nothing else. Many persons, I hear, have already lost most of their meat and are unable to buy more. Because of this condition, the seaport towns frequently had equipment for the slaughter of animals and the preservation of meat. Such places furnished a more reliable market, where the drovers could dispose of all their cattle and hogs at once, instead of peddling them to the planters, who might decide not to buy at all. In case such seaport towns were not satisfactorily equipped for slaughtering animals, the livestock could be sent to Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Charleston, where they could be slaughtered and packed. It is not at all improbable that much of the meat of Southern livestock was sold back to the Southern planters. Indeed, there is a tradition that such was the case. Other raw products, such as cotton, were treated in this fashion. The Southern folk, with a more balanced economy than that of the planter groups, were obviously a source of strength when the Civil War came. Frequently, all their men, including the heads of families, from 17 to 50, were in military service, but the younger children, boys and girls, the women, and the older men took the place of the absent men in the work and management of the farm. The plantations, however, were not as dependable as the farms in wartime, because the slaves, except the house servants, usually fled to the Union lines as soon as the invading army came within reach, and thus completely paralyzed further agricultural production. The farms, on the other hand, continued to operate provided the farmers had been able to conceal their work stock from the Union troops, which was probably not difficult in a country so heavily wooded as the South. It was, however, during the Reconstruction period that the plain folk revealed their real vitality and power of survival. Accustomed to every phase of work in any way relating to farming and rural life, and often frontier life, they had no such readjustment to make as the planter, who had usually little manual skill or experience in manual labor. With an axe, saw, auger, frow, drawing knife, and hammer, which might be assembled by a neighboring pool, the farmers held their house raisings and rebuilt with logs their houses and barns that had been burned during the war. With a sledgehammer and anvil, they fashioned crude plows and hoes from the worn out parts of old implements or from scrap iron and steel gathered here and there. They built crude wagons and carts, made horse collars by planting shucks, fashioned harness from hickory saplings with axe and drawing knife, and made traces and other parts of the harness from old pieces of chain or home tanned leather. Often, there would be a shortage of work stock, in which case, what few old animals that were left would be passed around from place to place until they were unable to go. In some cases, on record, men hitched themselves to the plow. In this way, the plain folk, by ingenuity, heartbreaking toil, patient endurance, self denial, and physical toughness, were able to survive the Civil War and Reconstruction and restore their farm economy, a vital portion of Southern economy. This was accomplished when the plantation system was in shambles or severely crippled from the devastation of war and the destruction of the slave labor system. It is not too much to say that the plain folk thus rescued the South from complete and perhaps final ruin with little or no aid or sympathy from any sources whatsoever outside the borders of their own section. It has often been claimed that the planter class dominated politics and determined the policies of the government. If so, how did they control the mass of voters? Was it done by intimidation through threat of physical violence to the voter or his family, a method quite common in Europe today and in many organizations in the United States? Such intimidation as a means of vote getting can, of course, be dismissed. It would have been physical and political suicide in a country where family ties and kinship were so numerous and close, and where such a threat would have been enthusiastically met, more than halfway, by men and boys handy with firearms. Did the aristocracy control the people by means of economic coercion? This also is a method too well known in the United States even to be discussed. This type of coercion was not possible in the antebellum South, however, since the Southern farmer usually owned his farm and was dependent on no one. All forms of coercion were in fact out of keeping with the character of either the common folk or the planters. What of the use of money to purchase votes necessary to win the election? Although there must have been in every community individuals whose vote could be purchased, there is no evidence of a widespread use of bribery to sway the vote of the people. Besides, this too was not in keeping with the character of either group. Reuben Davis says in his Recollections of Mississippi that there was little trickery and no corruption in the politics of those days, and a man who had dared tamper with a ballot box, or who had been detected in any fraud by the people, would have been torn in pieces without a moment's hesitation. The populace might be ignorant of many things, careless and indifferent about many more, but where honor and honesty were concerned, the great heart of the masses be true and fearless. Any man who aspired to lead them must be above reproach according to their standards. These standards were high enough and clean enough to force aspirants for leadership to at least outward conformity with the popular ideal, and the very existence of such an ideal kept the political atmosphere in a measure pure. The truth of the matter is that whatever influence the planters exercised over the political action of the common people was of a personal and local nature. It was based upon the respect the plain folk of the community had for the character and judgment of individual planters in that community, and such qualities of character and judgment in the planter were revealed only by his genuine participation in community affairs. It must be remembered, however, that there were few genuine planters outside the Black Belt, and that such personal influence and leadership was relatively narrow. If the farmers who lived outside the Black Belt were to be brought to support the interest of the planters, a less personal means of gaining their votes would have to be used, and this method had to be that of persuasion. Such persuasion was then as now, the chief business of the politicians. And unless the politicians were planters, and most, except on the national scale, were not, it would immediately become very much of a question as to whose interest was being served, whether that of the planters or of the plain folk, or of the politicians and their political organizations. The persuasive efforts made by both Whig and Democratic political leaders to win the political support of the rank and file was extraordinary. The two parties regarded few towns as too small for the establishment of rival newspapers. It was not uncommon for towns of less than 1,000 people to have two ably edited newspapers, whose emphasis would be political. Joint debates were a very popular mode of conducting a campaign. In these debates, apt rejoinder, witty repartee, and side comments were often more effective than oratory. The common folk loved good oratory, but they reveled in the witty thrust and parry, and in the practical joke. William H. Milburn tells of a political speaker who, as he puts it, was quite overthrown in the summit of a gorgeous flight of eloquence, and left to slink dumbfounded from the stage, when an unscrupulous adversary bawled out at his back, "Guess he wouldn't talk quite so highfalutin if he knowed his britches was torn out behind." These joint debates and political speeches, the one purpose of which was to gain popular support for political candidates, were usually successful in bringing together a great concourse of people. To make sure of a large attendance, scores of hogs, beeves, and young goats were barbecued, and barrels of lemonade were served. Seldom has the suffrage of the common folk been so courted as in the late antebellum South, and as a result of this, seldom have the people been so well posted on the political issues of the day. One of the most remarkable characteristics of the Southern people before the war, observes Reuben Davis, the Mississippi politician, was their universal enjoyment of public speaking. In consequence of this, the art of fluent speaking was largely cultivated, and a man could hope for little success in public life unless he possessed this faculty in some degree. Another consequence was that there was never a people better educated on political questions than the Southerner of that day. The significance of the role of the plain folk in politics may be partly evaluated from some of the provisions of the new state constitutions adopted under popular pressure between 1830 and 1860. Universal white manhood suffrage, the popular election of virtually all county and state officers, and the abolition of property qualifications for office holding in most cases were good examples. If the Democratic Party, as it has been constantly asserted, was primarily the agency of the common people, and the Whig Party that of the planters and business interests, then more often than not, in the lower South at least, the party of wealth took a beating. Nor were the Democrats at all tender hearted in the methods. In Alabama, for example, a Democratic legislature abolished the use of the three-fifths ratio in the election of congressmen and placed representation thus on the white basis. This greatly reduced the power of the Black Belt, which was the Whig stronghold, and gave the white counties control. This law was followed by the Reapportionment Act of 1843, which gerrymandered the congressional districts so as to ensure the continued control of the white counties. Then, in the session of 1855 to 1856, the Democratic legislature, in a redistricting act, gerrymandered the Whig districts still further, and although the Whigs had an estimated 45% of the population of the state, they were able to elect only two congressmen out of the seven under the act. Finally, it was the Democratic Party which took the lead in the secession of the Southern states. The Whig planters and businessmen generally were opposed to secession until the last and went out of the Union reluctantly. Reference has been frequently made to the fact that outside the older states, individuals were constantly rising from the farmer to the planter class. There are indications, in fact, that in some area a majority had thus risen from relative poverty, as had the older planter class in the seaboard states. Much depended on where the immigrant settled, as was pointed out in discussing migration. Settlers on rich soils usually rose more rapidly and further than those on poorer soils. Indeed, it appears that in many parts of the Black Belt, most of the settlers were either non slaveholders or small slaveholders, and that frequently both non slaveholders and small slaveholders became large slaveholders. But the plain folk made a much larger contribution to the leadership in other classes than they did to that of the planter class. It appears to be true in the lower South and in Tennessee and Kentucky that the bulk of lawyers, physicians, preachers, editors, teachers, businessmen, and political leaders below the national level were members of families who were poor or only comfortably well off. A young man of ability, energy, and determination, barring unusually bad luck, could scarcely fail of considerable success in any of the professions. He might never set the world on fire. In fact, he probably would have no such desire as a rule, but he could nearly always rise to local leadership. After examining the life histories of a large number of individuals who have risen from obscurity and comparative poverty, one cannot fail to see that they all follow a similar pattern. First, the parents, though often very poor, usually possessed education beyond the limits of mere literacy and had great respect for education as a means of attaining success. Then, too, they had a certain refinement, which their robust neighbors did not usually have. Not that they were aloof or prideful in their bearing, only they nursed a spark in their bosoms which they were able to pass on to some of their children. Next, the son or sons, who felt this spark of pride and ambition, utilized all possible opportunities at home and at school to acquire education. After he had acquired sufficient education and age, he would teach school, clerk in a store, or find other employment, which would enable him to save enough money to attend the academy or even college. Apparently, most young men of this type taught school. The third step was the preparation for his profession, usually the law, medicine, or the ministry. If he were to be a lawyer, ofttimes he read law under the direction of an attorney while teaching school, though occasionally he would attend a law school. When he had been admitted to the bar, he would usually enter a law office in a minor capacity, frequently as a sort of secretary and copyist for the firm. If he were shrewd and energetic, and young men of this type usually were, he would soon rise into a prominent position in the firm or as an independent attorney. The essentials of success were a practical knowledge of the law, an understanding of country jurors, some oratorical talent, and always cleverness in debate and repartee. There was much legal business in the rural South, and a lawyer of only modest talent could earn a good income. Such well known Georgians as Charles Tate, United States Senator and federal judge, William H. Crawford, United States Senator and Secretary of the Treasury, Richard Henry Wilde, State Attorney General and Congressman, William Towne, Congressman and Governor, Joseph E. Brown, Governor, Judge, and United States Senator, Alexander H. Stephens, Vice President of the Confederacy, Congressman, and Governor, followed the pattern sketched above. Indeed, says William H. Sparks, From the ranks of the poor but ambitious youth arose most of those men so distinguished in Georgia's earlier history. If the young man planned to become a physician, his preparation could be as little or as much as he desired and was able to pay for. The commonest procedure, even for the most ambitious, was to obtain employment with a practicing physician, such as keeping his books, driving his buggy, and running errands. In his spare time, if any, the apprentice read the medical books in the doctor's office and perhaps dissected a cadaver, at least for a while, until it spoiled completely. The doctor, no doubt, on his long drives, would teach his assistant, as best he could, the knotty problems of his books and in his practice. After 2 or 3 years of this apprenticeship, the student doctor could, with no real difficulty, obtain license to practice. In fact, he could, without much risk, set up most anywhere and practice without license. Perhaps the majority of apprentice physicians did not end their studies at this point, but went off for a course of lectures and study in a medical college, which would extend over a period varying from a few months to several years. Often, however, a poor young man planning to be a physician taught school or clerked in a store, just as had the prospective lawyer, for the purpose of saving enough money to complete his academic education and pay his expenses in a medical school. An examination of the life histories of large numbers of the clergy seems to indicate that an overwhelming majority were recruits from the ranks of the people, and that they acquired their education in a fashion similar to that of the young men preparing for the other professions. Many began their careers as schoolmasters, and indeed, many continued throughout life to teach school. The life histories of those who entered business, such as banking, merchandising, and real estate, better known as land speculation, are not as well known as are those of men who entered one of the learned professions. The cases which have been examined, however, indicate that, although the field was more limited in the South than those of planting and the professions, the percentage of those from the ranks of the common folk was high. Since education was for the poor but ambitious youth the gateway to success in business and the professions, what were the opportunities for acquiring the necessary education? Much has been said, and even more has been assumed, and therefore implied, to the effect that the educational institutions of the South were practically closed to all but the well to do because of the great expense of attending them. It is certainly not the purpose of this study to go into the history and theory of education in the Old South, but a few facts will be pointed out which may indicate that the obstacles to acquiring an education were not very great if an education was desired. The first thing is to observe that the common folk of the South obviously received relatively more schooling than has generally been supposed. By comparing the illiteracy of the Southern people with that of the people of New England, where, for well known reasons, a common school system had long existed, the South has been made to appear as a land where mass ignorance prevailed. In 1850, for example, the census showed that only 1.89% of the white population of New England above 20 years of age could not read, but in the South, 8.27% of this age group were illiterate. The fact was not advertised, however, that in the Northwest, where population was sparse and scattered, somewhat as in the rural South, 5.03% of those above 20 were illiterate. Just how illiterate, however, were the 8.27% of the South and the 5.03% of the Northwest? The answer is that, in comparison with the situation in most countries of the world at that time, the Southern folk were one of the most literate major groups of the entire world. In 1846, for example, of all the couples throughout England and Wales who got married, 32.6% of the men and 48.1% of the women affixed their marks instead of their signatures to applications for licenses. In the French army in 1851, of 311,218 conscripts, 34% could neither read nor write. The marriage and conscription records are very good cross sections of the young adult population, but in both France and England, the young people were more literate than the older groups because of the improvement of the common school systems. In Spain, Portugal, Italy, the Balkans, Poland, and Russia, illiteracy was between 90 and 95%. Only in the Scandinavian countries, Belgium and Holland, Prussia and Saxony, was the literacy of the people comparable with or greater than that of the South. Most of the children in the rural communities of the South, including those of the well to do, learned to read and write and cipher in the old field schools. These were elementary schools in which reading and writing and arithmetic, and sometimes higher subjects, were taught. They were financed primarily by subscription, each child being charged about $2.50 for a 5 or 6 months term and $1 for a 6 week summer session. Toward the end of the period, many of these schools were receiving aid from both the state and county. Most of the academies, which will be discussed presently, had primary departments that taught the same things as the old field schools. The academies were usually located in a town or village. Literacy is not education. However, if college attendance is any test of an educated people, the South had more educated men and women in proportion to population than the North or any other part of the world. According to the 1860 census, out of a white population of 7,400,000, there were 25,882 students enrolled in Southern colleges, whereas in the North, with a white population of over 19 million, there were only 27,408 students in college, and quite a large number of these were from the South. That is, there was one college student for each 247 white persons in the South and one in 703 in the North. It was, however, the academy more than the colleges that gave the poor but ambitious youth their education. There were, at the end of the antebellum period, about 2,500 academies in the South. Most had primary departments to take care of the youngsters of the town and vicinity. They all had what would have been called high school subjects, many of which are now taught in college, and all the larger, better equipped offered college work. The tuition of these academies, most of which had 10-month sessions, was low, about what the library, contingent, and athletic fee is in most of the schools today. The tuition per annum in the 57 academies of Georgia in 1860 averaged $15.50 for the elementary branches, and in the higher branches, $26. A study of over a score of academies in Alabama shows that the tuition for a student ranged from $15 to $25 in the primary departments and $25 to $35 in the high schools. Those academies that gave college work usually charged $40 to $50 a year. Board, room, and laundry ranged from $8 to $10 per month. In short, for less than $150, a young man or young lady could attend an academy for 10 months. Of course, the quality of work offered by the academies varied with the quality of teachers and equipment. Edgar Knight, in his Public Education in the South, says that the academy was a very highly respected means of education in the South, where it extended in greater numbers than in any other section of the country. The following subjects were usually taught in the academies: elementary, spelling, reading, writing, arithmetic, English grammar, and geography. High school: chemistry, logic, ethics, or moral philosophy; psychology, called intellectual science; physics, astronomy, political economy, composition, and rhetoric; Greek, Latin, French, algebra, geometry, trigonometry, mechanical drawing, analytical geometry, and calculus by request. In the female academies, drawing, painting, fine needlework, and music were always offered, the tuition being extra. All of these, of course, were not required. In fact, a student could take one or all of them as it suited him or his purse. The struggling country youth eager to acquire an education would take every course possible. It thus appears that the opportunity of acquiring an education, the gateway to the professions and to success, was quite favorable for the ambitious youth, however poor he might be. Indeed, it can be rather positively asserted that most young men, at least, who desired an education, could obtain one. The catchword, let it be observed, is desired.